Brilliant. So thank you everyone for joining us. So this is our interdisciplinary approaches to autism panel, which is very much looking at the medical humanities and kind of how that relates to autism. So a couple of pointers before we get going. We've got our Twitter hashtag Autistic Festival, if you want to kind of tweet while you're watching and get involved that way. We also have the Q&A button at the bottom of your screens. If you can use that to ask any questions. We'll be taking questions at the end of different halves. So if you've got a question for a particular speaker, put their name by it. Otherwise, I'll kind of open question out to the speakers in that section. Obviously, please be nice and respectful to each other, even if you disagree with different points. We're all kind of putting our time in, and it's very easy to disagree with each other nicely. And finally, the presentation will be recorded and shared afterwards, so you'll be able to see the slides and everything that's covered here at a later point as well. That's everything. We also, yep. So to introduce the panel, this is something I've been really keen to do. I've studied kind of medical humanities at Exeter as part of my original MA, and now I'm doing a part-time degree at Birkbeck, looking again at medical humanities. And kind of through that I've realised how much it crosses over with autism, and how many themes of medical humanities are themes that kind of come up in autism research generally. So it's very much a case of having this panel here to ensure that people, to show a whole different side to autism research, I guess, and to kind of extend the topics we're talking about so that other viewpoints get heard as well. So our first speaker is going to be Stuart Murray. Stuart is, hang on, I've just lost my PowerPoint. Stuart is Professor of Contemporary Literature at Leeds. And yeah, if you'd like to share your screen, Stuart.
Can everyone now see that? Yep, there you go. So would you like me to start, Beth, or are you going to do other introductions?
Yeah. No, okay. That was your entire introduction, I'm afraid.
Okay, that's fine. I wasn't sure if you were going to introduce other members of the panel, but that's absolutely fine.
No, I'll do you one by one.
Okay, hello everyone and good afternoon. Thanks very much to Bethan for the invitation to speak. Thanks very much to Autistica for putting on a great range of research topics around the subject of autism. Thanks in particular for starting with the idea of an interdisciplinary approach so early in the conference. I think that's very wonderful for those of us who come from an arts and humanities background and are not always placed at such a position of importance, I think, in research discussions of the condition. So I'm very grateful for that. Bethan said that I work in an English department, and so I wanted to give a little bit of a kind of background to the way in which I approach discussions of autism, sort of why I work on it and how as well. So I've worked on autism for nearly 20 years now. I started work at Leeds in 2003, and that was because of the diagnosis of two of my sons with autism in 2002. That led me to do something that in many ways came naturally to me. I started to read. I tend to understand the world around me by reading, and so I started to read about autism, and that became a career which included the two texts you can hopefully see on my slide, a book that came out with Liverpool University Press in 2008 and one that came out with Routledge in 2011. In 2003, things were very different than they are now. One way to look at it was we were only then 15 years past Rain Man, one of the most famous texts, if you will, in the history of representing autism. And there's been an incredible change in the cultural understanding of the condition between then and now. But I think one of the things that I want to say today is that many of the problematic issues of understanding autism through its cultural depictions still remain. And I want to talk through that with using a number of examples, and hopefully that argument will become clear. A word on my title maybe, because possibly those words are not as clear as they might be. I've called this cultural depictions and deployments, and not, for example, just representations, which was the title of my first book. So what I'm interested in, I think, one of my research attitudes towards autism is not simply the idea, for example, of how characters with autism are represented in either novels or films or plays or the media discourses more widely, but then how those representations are deployed, if you will, how they are used, what ideas of the condition emerge when a depiction of autism becomes a deployment of autism. I think that helps us get past what I might call the authenticity problem. And that would be this idea that really what matters in discussing autism in the media is simply whether a representation is good or bad. That a misrepresentation will be criticized, and something that's seen as being positive, a representation that's positive, will be valorized. I think we understand now, and in part we understand because of better interdisciplinary research, that that's too narrow a frame through which to look at the depictions of the condition. In part because I don't think there ever will be an authentic representation of the condition. I'm not sure that is possible given its status as a spectrum condition. And also I think it doesn't really raise questions of the ethics of fictionalizing, which I think are really important. And so I would like to go back to those depictions and ask that overwhelming question of how are they deployed? What do they mean? What kind of audiences do they engage when they are deployed? And how do we all work with those ideas that autism, of autism that come out of it as a result? One of the things I've always been interested in as a non-scientist, as a non-clinician, has been the language that clinical descriptions of autism use. I was always drawn, I remember during the time that my own children were being diagnosed, to the language of diagnosis, to the way in which it set up an idea of what autism is. And I find myself still going back to that. So one of the things that strikes me in the latest DSM-5 definition of autism, the Diagnostic Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders, which is used around the world in the processes of diagnosis, I'm always drawn back to the way in which its characterization of autism that's used in the diagnostic process is so full of negatives. I mean, just to pick up on some words: impairment, restrictions, deficits, limited, inflexibility. All of those words come up very close to one another in the standard outline of what autism is understood to be from a clinical point of view. And what happens there, I've always said in my research, is that you get initially then at this kind of almost like foundational clinical level, you get a language that tells you the condition is a problem. It's a problem because it's made up of all these negatives. That if you have inflexibility, it's implied that there is a flexibility that will be better. That if you have a restriction, you have something that needs to be unrestricted, and so on and so forth. And I think if you understand something as a problem, it comes naturally to assume that there must be solutions. So this idea that one of the deployments of autism through its clinical language might be it's a problem that needs a solution has, I think, had, certainly in the last 20 years or so that I've been looking at it, very strong afterlife. The interventions in cultural stories that work with that logic, the idea that there's a problem that needs a solution, they often come in certain kind of frames. very often the way that autism is portrayed in culture sort of oscillates between a certain idea of autism as hero and an idea as autism as something that needs restitution or redemption, a narrative in which a character with autism requires some sense of coming to terms with themselves, or other people need to come to terms with them. And if a problem cannot be solved, then at least it can be moved to a mode that we might say is seen to be manageable. Certainly when I first started work on, for example, films with autism, it was really interesting to note that a lot of the films that were made during the 1990s, for example, very much depicted as autism as something that could and should be cured. And although we no longer talk of the language of curing autism, it's not that recently that was not the case. And so I think there has been a build-up of this idea of the stories that tell about the condition as requiring some sense of this redemption, restitution, the removal of the autistic self to create some sense of a non-autistic normalcy. The modes of storytelling that these narratives often use are very recognizable. They are, as I've just said, something we might understand as recovery narratives. They're often stories of sentimentality. I think one of the things that interests me, and it might interest a number of you listening who are family members and who have autism of the family, is they often tap into the idea of sentimentality within family relationships. And there, I think one of the oldest stories has been the effect of the autistic child on the non-autistic parents. The success of the BBC's drama series, The A Word, I think, is just one of the latest manifestations of that storyline in which a child with autism becomes meaningful for the way in which they can be read through the drama of their parents' relationships. So in this sense, I guess that's an example of what I'm saying, is how autism is seen too often in media stories to become something that can only be understood through other contexts. So it is understood through family relationships. It's understood through gender relationships. Boys are understood to be autistic in certain ways, girls less so. And certainly when I started doing my research, work around girls and autism, women and autism, had nowhere near the sophistication that it does now. I wanted to use one particular example of a text, and I think a very successful text, that might give detail to some of the things I've been saying. And that is, if I hold the book up, maybe you can see it, and maybe you know of it, the book, The Reason I Jump, by Naoki Higashida, which was published in 2013 to much acclaim. I think many people found it a text which gave detail to what it was like to be autistic. My copy that I'm holding here has at the top and says, "One boy's voice from the silence of autism." If you don't know the book, it is most of it. It's a series of 58 questions that are put to Naoki Higashida, who's a young boy with autism, to which he then replies. If you do know the book, you can see, or you might remember from its title even, The Reason I Jump, that it's a book in which Higashida gives reasons for his behavior. And he gives reasons for his behavior because of an understanding that as a person with autism, he needs to justify who he is. He needs to give reasons for his behavior. He needs, if you like, to validate what it is he's doing. I think one of the reasons why the book is so successful is because it had an introduction and was in part translated by the novelist David Mitchell, he who wrote Cloud Atlas, very famous for his fiction, particularly in the UK. And one of the things that I'm struck with when thinking about this book is exactly that kind of idea that autism becomes meaningful through other contexts. Because here I think The Reason I Jump is in lots of ways made meaningful by the fact that Mitchell intervenes. He tells us what Higashida's book means to him. He particularly tells us, and I think this is interesting, that Higashida's book allowed for a breakthrough between Mitchell's relationship with his own autistic son. And it's a strange thing to read, that at times it almost seems like the reason I jump appears most important, not because of Higashida and what he has to say about himself, but because of what Mitchell can now think about his own autistic son. So I think there's an incredible tension here between the way in which a boy with autism might talk about himself, may say, listen, this is how I react to the world. This is how I experience the world in visual and sensory ways. This is why I behave like I do. All of those things that were so popular with the readership. And then the very idea that the book is framed with this introduction that discusses autism in so many other kinds of ways, including, and I'll just quote this from the introduction, when Mitchell says that Higashida lives in an unedited, unfiltered, and scary as hell reality that he calls home. And I think that kind of contradiction, that there's so much in the book where Higashida is saying how he feels, and the assumption on Mitchell's part that it is unedited, unfiltered, and scary as hell reality is home. That contradiction is so true of many texts about autism. What slightly concerns me, I think, is that we still praise many cultural depictions of autism for giving us increased understandings of the subject. But the deployment of those depictions, the deployment of those television series and life writing and novels, nevertheless are making the point that there is a scary as hell world out there that needs interpreting. And these two ideas, it seems to me, run parallel, and they don't talk to each other, and they produce a contradiction that is not solved, and I think in many ways is not in the best interests of the people with autism who are being represented in those texts. So just to end up with a kind of overwhelming thought, or not so much an overwhelming thought, sorry, an overarching thought about what I've been saying. I was really interested when I saw that this panel, as Bethan put it, was seen to be a medical humanities panel. When I first started working on autism, the very idea of medical humanities as a subject didn't exist. It now has become something that brings a variety of critical approaches towards the study of health and medicine, and of course autism is included in that. One of the words that I've come away with as a scholar who now works in medical humanities, one of its key critical terms, it seems to me, is this idea of entanglement and its associated word risk. And I think what's needed to get beyond some of these problematic deployments of autism is a far greater sense of a genuine interdisciplinary entanglement, in which we do not assume that cultural depictions and cultural representations are somehow the poor relation of hard science, of clinical versions of the condition. Because I think the power, the soft power, if you will, of fiction and media and the way they tell their stories of autism needs to be woven through and understood by those who practice clinical and scientific approaches to autism. That entanglement would strike me as something that would be far more profitable in order for us to approach better understandings than we have now. So that, in a scholarly critical sense, I think is what I want to say about what a genuine interdisciplinarity can bring. And if you are interested in this, I would say there's some excellent texts on medical humanities that give a sense of its working methods and how that might be possible. At the same time, to think of autism within all of this, I still go back to the things I said in those two books I wrote, that I think the best thing we can do, the most important thing we can do, is to carry on listening to people with autism, working with people with autism, and to accept their validity of being in the world. Not to preface it, as Mitchell, I think, does with Higashida, not to somehow put it in brackets and make it more meaningful because of what it means to other people, but to understand it as a sincerity as a way of being in the world, as something that deserves respect for being seen on its own terms. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much for that, Stuart. That was really interesting to listen to. So we'll take questions for Stuart at the end of this session, but obviously use a Q&A button if you want to submit any. Next up, we have Laura Seymour, who is talking about reading for autism in Ben Jonson's Epicoene? That's probably wrong.
However you want to pronounce that, I'm happy.
Laura works at Birkbeck in 17th century literature department and was one of my seminar teachers on my module. So if you want to share your screen, you're all good to go, Laura.
Well, I'm having a bit of trouble sharing my screen actually. It comes up with some other options.
Make sure you're clicking the main button, not the arrow next to it.
Oh, okay, yeah.
Yeah. Perfect.
Thanks, Beth. Can you hear me? So I'm really happy to be following Stuart because I'm also talking about representation. I'm going to talk about the character Morose in Ben Jonson's play Epicene, or The Silent Woman from 1609. In the list of characters, Morose is described as a gent who loves no noise. Morose is this character's name, and it's also his identity. So in Jonson's time, the adjective morose could mean sullen, gloomy, sour-tempered, and unsocial. Later in the 17th century, the word gained what I think is a more positive meaning of scrupulous and painstaking. And I'm going to talk about this literary character and how I think he has been misunderstood. He is traditionally read as a villain or a misanthrope, but when I read him within the disciplines of neurodiversity studies, as well as within the conventions of literary comedy, I found I understood the whole play and its comedic conventions differently. My response to Morose is partly a personal one. I was drawn to particular traits that resonated with me as an autistic individual, so not just his hypersensitivity to noise, but also his love of declaiming long lists of specific items and his hatred of small talk. I'm also interested in how Ben Jonson, the author of the play, can be seen as intervening in debates on the accessibility of clapping in the theatre 400 years before our present day controversies about clapping and autism in public spaces. There's a small content note for this talk. I talk about bullying and manipulation in the talk because unfortunately Morose gets bullied by the other characters in the play. So Epicene was first performed by a company of child actors called the Children of the Queen's Revels. This play is a comedy, and I think one argument is that it makes the comedy funnier when you have children playing adults because it sort of magnifies the foibles of the adult characters. But in the book recommended at the bottom of this slide, the scholar Lucy Munro has written a much more in-depth account, and this book also has a really good discussion of Epicene in it. It's sometimes said that the play wasn't very successful in Ben Jonson's lifetime and then later became successful, but actually, as Munro shows, it seems to have been quite popular in the 17th century. So here's an overview of the plot. So Morose is a rich bachelor who hates noise. Morose's nephew Dauphine wants Morose's money. However, Morose plans to marry and give all his money to his wife and children. Dauphine disguises a nameless servant boy as a silent woman called Epicene. Morose marries Epicene because she is so quiet, but then after the marriage, Epicene stops being silent, and the other characters invade Morose's house and make noise there as a kind of wedding celebration. Morose now hates being married, and he agrees to make Dauphine his heir, if the other characters will let him get divorced. So Dauphine has successfully tricked his uncle Morose to get his money. Morose is treated very harshly by other characters, but he's also been treated harshly by literary critics and theatre audiences. And it feels to me that, this has been because our culture does not yet properly value people who are different in the way that Morose is different. And I wanted to see in my own research what happened when we did value him. So a word in the back of my mind is debility, a term from the queer and disability studies scholar Jasbir Puar, designating certain populations as vulnerable to physical and emotional harm and wearing them down. And though I'm hesitant to apply Puar's deeply serious work unproblematically to what is essentially a ridiculous Renaissance comedy, in my research I look at how literature like this, like Epicene, can be wearing to experience as an autistic person. And in its current form, I think this play is an example of culture supporting our state of debility. Epicene isn't very often performed. It was revived in 1989 at the Swan Theatre in Stratford-on-Avon, directed by Danny Boyle. Morose was played by David Bradley, who more recently has been in Game of Thrones. In archival footage of this play, you can see audiences laughing uproariously at Morose and his foibles. And literary critics and theatre reviewers tend to see Morose as the play's villain, or someone to be laughed at, not really deserving our sympathy because he brings it all on himself. And they tend to base this purely on the fact that he hates noise and he doesn't love raucous socializing. So here are some quotations. He has a pathological aversion to noise. He's a hysteric, a self-made martyr to noise. He's the unlovesome Morose, the dire curmudgeon, the old misanthrope, and so on. Although Anne Fitzgerald does note that it's still not fair to bully him. In the programme for this production, an essay by the critic Simon Trussler likened the play's sadism to the bear baiting that also went on in the Renaissance theatre. But Trussler also absolved audiences from guilt at laughing at Morose. He bizarrely suggested that there's no need to feel uneasy at Morose's fate, implying that Morose brought it on himself. So one's unease at the end of The Silent Woman is not really on Morose's account. He has, in a sense, got what he wants. Obviously, the word autism didn't exist in the 17th century, but in my current research, I'm exploring what happens when we claim or perform Morose as autistic and celebrate him as such. What new readings of the play might we get? So here are some of the traits that I enjoyed about Morose. So firstly, he's adjusted his environment to suit his hypersensitivity to sound. His doors are covered in padding, so he doesn't hear people knocking. He lives down a narrow alley, so no traffic can pass by his house. And his servants wear padded shoes and communicate in sign language rather than speaking. So his house is amazing. The only sound he does like is his own voice, and he loves listing specific things rather than giving a general picture. There's one moment where he talks about going to court, and he says he hates court because of the noise, and then he lists all of the things one might find in a court. So he says, there's such a noise in the court that they have frighted me home. And then he lists the citations, appellations, allegations, certificates, attachments, interrogatories, references, convictions and afflictions, and so on. On a more serious note, he has trouble advocating for himself in court because of these difficulties. Morose also does not see the point of small talk, particularly greetings, and this really resonated with me. So one character, Truewit, asks Morose to say hello to people, to salute them. And Morose says, well, what's the point of saying hello to people? You know, this kind of thing is just a waste of time, and it's also a bit fake. So he said, I had rather do anything than wear out time so unfruitfully, sir. And then he kind of talks about, you know, I wonder how these common forms as God save you and you are welcome are come to be a habit in our lives, or I am glad to see you, when I cannot see what the profit can be of these words, so long as it is no whit better with him, whose affairs are sad and grievous, that he hears this salutation. So what he's saying is, what is the point of all these cultural niceties? Saying to someone that we're glad to see them doesn't make their life any better. I find that reading Morose sympathetically exposes ironies within the play. For example, in the 1989 production, the theatre programme demands that we stifle even the tiniest of noises, including those involved in reading the programme itself. So it says, please remember that noise, such as whispering, coughing, rustling programmes, and the bleeping of digital watches can be distracting to performers and also spoils the performance for other members of the audience. I found this hilarious and deeply ironic that the programme encourages us to mock Morose on stage, but the programme also sounds like morose in this aversion to noise, a list of specific things that cause noise. As I've been working on my research, another issue that's been in the news a lot is clapping and the ethics of clapping in schools, universities, and other public places. Texts like the BBC article on this slide have been asking, you know, should we in the 21st century clap at the end of a play or a lecture if we risk upsetting the autistic people in the audience, for example. And I think Ben Jonson was already interested in this question 400 years ago with Epicene. Jonson thinks about how his literary character Morose interacts with his theatrical environment. Morose leaves the stage before the other characters at the end of the play, and in the epilogue, Jonson suggests that Morose has left early because the audience is about to clap, and Morose doesn't want to hear that. So the final few lines of the play run, "Spectators, if you like this comedy, rise cheerfully, and now Morose has gone in, clap your hands. It may be that noise will cure him, at least please him." And this statement that Morose might be cured can be read in various ways. Perhaps it indicates that it is a kind of cure for the actor to no longer be playing this character, which obviously, you know, is not something I agree with. So, you know, a cure that will enable the actor to enjoy applause. Or perhaps Jonson believes that by clapping, audience members can cure Morose of his hatred of noise. And this kind of miraculous cure was quite a popular trope on the Renaissance stage. If you're interested, I recommend this book by Roe Hayveld at the bottom of the slide. So obviously it's really kind of problematic idea that he might even want to be cured. Or perhaps Jonson means that by appearing on stage to absorb the applause, Morose is kind of self-sacrificingly showing his affection for the audience. Or maybe kind of disturbingly, Jonson is suggesting that we should torment Morose by clapping at him and join in with bullying him. Really though, I think the obvious answer that Jonson is gesturing towards is that if we love Morose, we should not clap at the end of the play. And indeed there are some stories, well, these stories might be apocryphal, but there are stories of 17th century audiences not applauding the play. In the first quarter, so a kind of very early version of this play text, the typescript of the epilogue creates a kind of inverted pyramid shape. And this is emphasized by the printer's ornament below, which is a kind of inverted triangle as well. And here the final three words, least please him, are in a line all by themselves. And I think this emphasizes that rather than being, you know, a pleasing cure, clapping is the thing that will least please Morose. So I think 400 years before the debates on the BBC, writers like Jonson were making us think, are we congratulating the actor on his performance, or are we annoying Morose when we clap? Rather than clapping being our automatic reflex at the end of this play, Jonson makes us reflect on clapping and disability. You know, should we clap? I think that it's important that calling a literary character autistic actually helps us to reevaluate the text that they're in. Otherwise, autism is just a label we have stuck on the character that doesn't give us any new knowledge. Reading Morose autistically did, I think, develop my understanding of the play and shook it up. So first I started to think about Renaissance utopias and Morose's house as an autistic utopia. Focusing empathetically with Morose on the politics of noise, I also reread the play's main character Epicene in the context of the play's theme of subgender in quite a different way. So traditionally, the play has been seen as centering around a big reveal, whereby Epicene is not really a woman, but is actually a servant boy. But looking closely at the play and its sources, Morose doesn't really remark on Epicene's gender. All he cares about is silence, people being respectful of his space, and people not making unnecessary small talk around him. And this led me to think that the play is not really about a binary gender reveal at all, but more that a person who seemed to be silent is actually noisy. Finally, I got thinking about conventions of clapping in the theatre. I find it personally really difficult to go to the theatre when there is clapping. And it got me thinking about whether there was a kind of accessibility discourse already in play in the early modern theatre. Thank you.
Thank you, Laura. I'm sure we're all doing our autistic waving clap as we would in an actual conference right now. Our flappy hands. That was really good. Right, after Laura, we have Bonnie Evans speaking now. So just a reminder, if you've got any questions for Laura, which we'll answer in the Q&A section, please put them in the Q&A box. So Bonnie is going to speak about how autism came to achieve such significance within the psychological sciences. Bonnie is part of the film department in Queen Mary's, University of London.
Hello.
Hi.
Hi. Can everybody see me?
You need to turn your camera on, I think, still. Yeah.
Hi, everybody. And thank you so much to Bethan for organising this event. I'm just going to share my screen. Is that working? So, yeah, I assume that's working now. So, yeah, the topic of this presentation then is why autism, and specifically autism and not any other word or category or diagnosis, why autism became such an important category for describing psychological differences amongst individuals, and why it has become now one of the most dominant psychological diagnoses in the 21st century. So I've written about this amongst other things in my book, The Metamorphosis of Autism. And I just wanted to talk a bit about how my work moved on to this topic and then go on to answer the question in a bit more depth. So my own interest in autism actually developed from a wider interest in how humans throughout history have been named, classed, classified and represented in different ways. And from a wider medical humanities perspective, I was always very interested in the work of Michel Foucault, Nicholas Rose and others working in the history of the human sciences. And one thing that you realize when you start to look historically at human classification is that psychological diagnoses in particular in the past have always ebbed and flowed depending on time and location. One classic example of this in the history of medicine is hysteria, which was a very common diagnosis in the early 20th century, but the category then slowly waned away and over time. Now, that doesn't mean that psychological categories are not extremely important descriptive terms or identities. And as a historian, my interest is not in either invalidating or proving the existence of any category. It's more about understanding how sort of diagnostic tools get employed to direct resources and attention to certain areas at certain times in history. So the autism diagnosis only really began to take off substantially in the 1990s, and particularly in the USA and the UK. And from the mid-2000s, the level has become relatively stable now. And of course, then people began to ask questions. Well, why did that happen? Was there always autism? And now we're more aware of it. Have the psychological sciences advanced so much that now we're able to classify psychological types more accurately than we were before? Will autism disappear like some other categories that grow and then disband? Or is there perhaps something that is different about autism? And obviously there were some quite bad scientific explanations that were put forward by Andrew Wakefield and others around vaccines as an explanation for the increase at the time. But the truth is that it's incredibly difficult to pin down the definition of autism. So ever since the early 20th century, the theory of autism has been a device or a mechanism for thinking through the early stages of psychological development. So not as a diagnosis, but just as a concept. And it's been plagued with controversy about its status as well for a long time. This is the first description of autistic thought by Eugene Bleuler, who's a Swiss psychiatrist in 1911. And Bleuler regarded autism as essentially just an early form of thought. and this is how he described autistic thought. He said it took place in symbols, in analogies, in fragmentary concepts, and in accidental connections. But for him, it was just a form of thought. And up until the mid-20th century, this, sorry, next slide. Yeah, so up until the mid-20th century, this definition of autism built around Broiler's ideas was relatively stable until quite a big fault line appeared between two very different sort of psychological approaches to autism and human development. And it was this sort of fault line that created the autism that we are more familiar with today. So between 1910 and 1950, the most significant attempts to categorize, carve up, and understand human development came in two distinct forms: psychoanalysis and intelligence testing. Now, these two human sciences had very different goals. So psychoanalysis built on Sigmund Freud's work and gave voice to the unique experiences of the individual at a time when capitalism was expanding and family ties were losing power. It was an individual science based on individual cases. But intelligence testing, on the other hand, built on the French psychologist Alfred Binet's attempt to quantify and order human capacities and capabilities. And intelligence testing served more of a bureaucratic objective of sort of categorizing and sorting out children for an expanding education and institutional care system at this time. And up until the 1950s, these two different approaches were largely independent. So the US psychiatrist Leo Khanna is often credited with creating the autism diagnosis in 1943. But in fact, autism was described in adults and children long before this, not only by Broiler. And in my work, I've written quite a lot about how Jean Piaget, one of the earliest developmental psychologists who was based in Switzerland, described many instances of autism in his work in the 1920s. This is his description of autistic thought listed here. And Piaget and his contemporaries considered autism as a kind of symbolic thinking in which visual imagery dominated an individual's thoughts and affected their ability to think in language, logically, and to relate socially. Khanna's understanding was very similar to this. He argued that autistic children thought in what he termed a fantastical way that made it difficult to relate to others. The difference was that Khanna did try to claim autism as a specific syndrome, but his efforts were frequently challenged at the time by other specialists who said you can't call autism a syndrome because it's a developmental concept, which is what it was until the 1950s. It was a developmental concept. So in the interwar period, many psychologists such as Susan Isaacs, pictured here, understood and employed the autism concept in their theories of development, largely drawing from Jean Piaget. However, there were cases where the autism concept was not employed very often, and that was where psychologists were studying children who had undergone IQ testing and who were deemed supposedly not suitable for education. This was a belief at the time. So there did become then a group of children who then became adults for whom psychologists were not very interested in individual development, in their visual thought, in their dreams, in their fantasies and autistic thought in this early period. So for those who aren't familiar with the history of mental deficiency law and eugenics in the British context and also internationally, many children and adults during the interwar period who were assumed to have low IQ were placed in mental deficiency institutions such as these. This is Meanwood Park Colony. This is inside, the next slide. There was often an obsession with ordering, sorting and regimenting bodies. And in here, the staff were not so much interested in the complexity of individual psychology. There was no luxury or time to explore that, essentially. So what this meant was that the two approaches to human psychology largely existed independently. Psychoanalysis interested in individual development, the social development of the individual, and IQ testing, a science that was preoccupied really at this time with segregating populations, and they didn't really cross paths before 1950. However, after the Second World War, both Freudian psychoanalysis and Binet's intelligence classifications began to look increasingly shaky. So the war burst apart both of these psychological narratives, and it raised new questions. Psychoanalytic ideas of individual progress were shattered, and of course the spectre of Nazism made social divisions based on human types politically toxic, and the idea of mental deficiency was quite rightly challenged at this time. This is a photograph, the next one coming up, from a 1957 book that argued that segregating groups based on intelligence was hugely problematic. Mental deficiency institutions were overcrowded, and this kind of segregation had to stop. So from the late 50s, these institutions began to close down. Some were reinvented as hospitals, but their ethos and meaning was severely challenged by the war. And it was no longer possible then to stratify and separate society in the way that eugenicists and IQ testers wanted to. And it was the war that drew attention to the incompatibility of psychological methods that had developed independently. And it was the war that also inspired new approaches to human psychology. Now, these new approaches attempted to combine the individual psychology of social development, psychoanalysis and developmental psychology, with quantitative methods developed by IQ testers. So in other words, they used the techniques of intelligence testing, quantification, to capture the complexity of ego development and social interaction. And this is what set the scene for an entirely new kind of autism research in the post-war period. What many people don't fully appreciate is sort of the enthusiastic zeal with which new autism research was conducted from the 1960s. Many people viewed it as incredibly progressive. It was a way to move past the cruel eugenicist philosophies of the earlier period. And the rise of the autism diagnosis went hand in hand with this sort of reforming zeal for social scientific measurement and progressive change. And autism researchers of the 1960s actually created a whole new paradigm of human development. They had to refashion these broken sciences that had supported broken social systems, and a new paradigm was developed that was more suitable to the demands of the post-war social services and the post-war social climate, and the radical reorganization of the state social services that accompanied that. This is a quote from an MP, William Compton Carr, in 1960, explaining just how important this new project to define and understand human development was. Now, in the 1960s, the British psychiatrist John Wing, who's the husband of Lorna Wing, supervised the first epidemiological study of autism anywhere in the world, conducted by Victor Lotter. And this was a huge challenge at the time. Lotter went to what he considered the sort of perhaps most normal or regular county of the United Kingdom, Middlesex, to conduct this study, and he began to count all the children with autism who lived there. Now, of course, when he did this, no one had any way of measuring, defining autism. It was just a concept. But of course, how can you count autism unless you can measure it? So if you look on the right, these are the categories that he used in this first epidemiological study. He included children based on a list of behaviors. So these included things such as jumping, flapping, toe walking, solitary, and things like this. Now, one of the leading child psychiatrists at the time, Mildred Creek, had said it was impossible to categorize autism in this way. She argued that apparent awareness of one's own personal identity, which was a point that she listed if you look on the left-hand side, and also an inability to relate to others was sort of critical to how the concept was understood at that point. But Wing and Lotter said, well, no, we have to start counting this. Otherwise, we can't justify the kinds of interventions that we're arguing for in the post-war period. So they said, if we start counting, we'll find autism and we'll define autism through this sort of process. And what actually happened in the attempt to sort of count and measure autism was that this radically transformed the meaning of the term. So whereas in the early 20th century, autism referred to states of sort of excessive visual thought and vivid dreams, it was a very visual category, the first autism. The quantifiable autism of the 1960s actually came to mean the exact opposite of this. So it was only after 1960 that autism as a diagnosis came to be seen as an impairment or absence or lack of thought. And this obsession with impairments in autism becomes very dominant in the 80s and 90s. But nevertheless, this behavioral model of autism, the one that was based on behavioral categorizations, was very significant to social changes that happened after the war. Throughout the 1960s, new schools and organizations were established to cater for autistic children, created with a spirit of enthusiasm, inclusion, and social change. And in this way, the autism diagnosis, it became something of a beacon of a new kind of inclusion, and its impact was really remarkable. In the UK, Lorna Wing and the National Autistic Society used the category to repeatedly campaign the government for specific services for those diagnosed. By the 1970s, all large state-run mental deficiency institutions, some had functioned as sort of quasi-hospitals in the 50s and 60s, but they were finally shut in the 70s. And there was, amongst psychologists at the time, there was a distinct lack of expertise in dealing with this new situation that had been created after the war. And the new generation of autism psychologists started to argue that they understood what was needed. They criticized both the psychoanalytic methods and IQ testing, and they said we need a new approach to human psychology, and that was what was really developed from the 1970s onwards. So it was in this social and political climate that Judith Gould and Lorna Wing conducted an epidemiological study that became the benchmark then for almost every epidemiological study of autism ever since. And Lorna Wing in particular crystallized this impairment model of autism, the triad of impairments. And autism was also then defined as part of a continuum or a spectrum into which social impairments could be grouped. And this was the birth of the autism spectrum. And it was via this study, and also because of the changes that were going on in social health and education at the time, that the autism diagnosis really expanded. This was the sort of height of the social impairment model of autism, but it emerged at this particular point in political and social history. And it was created to fill a gap that existed then in provisions within social care. So what's important to note here is that the autism diagnosis from the 60s to the 90s grew up as a kind of resistance to a neoliberal agenda. The impairment model of autism was a tool. It was a tool for sort of sheltering certain people from the growing challenges of global capitalism. And in the years since, it's become an important means for affirming identity. The diagnosis gained a foothold at the end of the 20th century because it ensured special educational services to autistic individuals. It also slotted very neatly into new models of social and economic liberalism in the 80s and 90s that sort of aspired to dismantle systems of social welfare. And so it was a category of resistance, from the very early period, and even the earlier models were. But it should be no surprise then that the most unwavering support for the autism diagnosis occurred under Thatcher and Reagan, because it offered a kind of protection for citizens in this period. Yet it's also, of course, this impairment model of autism that has very rightly come under fire by many neurodiversity advocates in the recent period. Of course, autism isn't just an impairment or even a triad of impairments. It's a psychological concept that's been around for over 100 years. But in the past, you know, psychologists had to make these arguments about integration in order to unite these different styles of psychological thinking. And that's just a summary of points at the end, but I think I have to finish now. So thank you.
Thank you, Barney. That was really interesting, and it was great to see so much history put together. Next up, we have Rachel Fricker, who is at Sussex University, and she'll be talking about broadening our perspective, autistic hyperfocus. Okay, thank you, Rachel.
Hiya. Sorry, just back to. Hi, so I'm Rachel Fricker. I'm going to be speaking on broadening our perspective of autistic hyperfocus. My supervisors are Sophie Forster and Nicola Yule, and as has already been said, I'm based at the School of Psychology at the University of Sussex. I will warn you, this is a slightly more scientific talk than the rest, but I hope to bring in some of my experience as an autistic researcher. So I chose hyperfocus as something to research because it's something that I enjoy, and it's a positive aspect of my autism. However, when I found that when I've started to talk to people about hyperfocus, they have this vision of it being something that's much more like some kind of superpower that allows me to be productive all the time, or in fact other autistic people. And for those of you who experience hyperfocus or have hyperfocus in your life will know that it can be like that, or it can be like this, and you might not notice the danger right next to you, or you might wait a very long time before realizing that you haven't drunk for some hours. So as this slide's a little bit about my coming to this as a PhD researcher and trying to work out how to research this topic, because it's something that is commonly talked about in the autistic community and neurodiverse community more broadly, but it's even talked about a little bit in the literature, but it's rarely defined, and when it is defined, it's defined by researchers as opposed to the neurodiverse community. And also just to say that hyperfocus is something that I think is first talked about in terms of ADHD. Now we know that ADHD has a big overlap with autism, so part of my research has been to also look at whether or not what we see in terms of autistic hyperfocus is unique to, well, not necessarily unique to autistic individuals, but because whether or not they have ADHD as well. And so far it seems like that is the case. So last year a review paper was put together which suggested 4 qualities of hyperfocus. That it included an intense state of concentration or focus, a reduced awareness of external stimuli, the task being enjoyable or salient, and improved task performance. I would think that there needs to be a 5th characteristic added of difficulty disengaging with the task once you are hyperfocusing. This really fits into the monotropic model of autism, which sees attention as a limited resource, within where autistic people tend to experience attentional tunnels where their attention is naturally focused but difficult to reorient, in contrast to people who primarily experience the world in a polytropic way, where they divide their attention between items of multiple salience. And a good example of this is through communication, so being aware of tone of voice and body language, as well as the content of what you're saying, as well as considering the other person's perspective. So I think this blog post sums it up well. At each moment I must choose to focus on one thing or the other, and once I've focused on one thing, then the other disappears. So McDonald and Milton have already identified that flow may well be common in autistic individuals, and flow has a lot of similar characteristics and overlap with hyperfocus, particularly in terms of when people are involved with this, they are operating at a high level of skill, and also they may lose track of time or lose or have less awareness of their environment. In terms of improved task performance, I was wondering whether or not autistic individuals may actually autistic individuals may be better at this in terms of hyperfocus, because of the fact that they also have an improved attention to detail, as this is something that we already know in terms of research autistic people do better on, or in fact maybe hyperfocus, irrespective of attention to detail, allows people to have improved task performance. So my aim for my first study is to add to our current understanding on what hyperfocus is, to identify if the adult hyperfocus questionnaire, a questionnaire that was originally developed for use with adults with ADHD, could be a potential measure for use with autistic people, investigate if paying more attention to detail in daily life is a significant predictor of increased frequency of hyperfocus experiences, and investigate if difficulty reorienting attention was a significant predictor of increased frequency of hyperfocus experiences. So I had a number of pre-registered hypotheses, and these were that autistic traits would predict reported hyperfocus experiences when we account for ADHD, even when we account for ADHD symptoms, and so would task switching difficulty. And that attention to details would predict hyperfocus experiences, but this wouldn't be altered by ADHD symptoms. Obviously, we're aware that actually attention to detail is not predicted in ADHD. So this might be a way in which the neurodiversities separate somewhat. So the adult hyperfocus questionnaire was the questionnaire that we were looking at in terms of its validity, and it had a number of items which people scored in terms of the frequency that they experience them, such as, in general, when I am busy doing something I enjoy or something that I am very focused on, I forget to attend to my personal needs, e.g. I forget to sleep or eat, or I wait until the last minute to go to the bathroom. We also had a traits questionnaire, so it includes things like I have to warm myself up to the idea of visiting an unfamiliar place, again scored on frequency, and then we used the autism quotient for its subscales to measure attention to detail and attention switching. So these subscales include items such as I tend to notice details that others do not, or I find it easy to do more than one thing at once. And we were really interested in what individuals' experiences were in terms of whether or not they matched with increased hyperfocus. And obviously we needed to control for ADHD symptoms, so we used this adult self-report scale of ADHD symptoms, which is developed in conjunction with the World Health Organization. So we had 341 students gave consent, 41 didn't complete the study, and a further 9 were excluded because they responded so fast it would have been difficult for them to read the question and respond quickly enough. 291 undergraduate psychology students data was used, of which 241 were female, 49 male, and 1 non-binary. Our findings were that autistic traits and attention switching predict hyperfocus independently of ADHD. That attention to detail predicts hyperfocus, but not ADHD symptoms. And we had this unexpected finding. We had an unexpected finding regarding hyperfocus and communication, which I'll talk about in a second. So I'm just going to whisk through this quickly, but just to show you that autistic traits did predict hyperfocus, and this was independent of whether or not ADHD was controlled for. And the same with attention switching, it did predict hyperfocus independent of ADHD, and attention to detail did predict hyperfocus, but because attention to detail is not predictive of ADHD traits, we're just being cat moms here, so she obviously wants to be attentive to the detail. We're in terms of the subscales, the green items are things that I've already talked about. I just really wanted to quickly talk about this communication, social skills and pragmatic language. As you can see, the communication and social skills, the communication and pragmatic language were both significant when you corrected for the fact that there were multiple tests being done, whereas social skills was not. And so just to talk a little bit about what that represents. So the communication and pragmatic language subscales, I mean, if you think back to the monotropic model, in terms of thinking that these are significant, we can perhaps think of why. So it's got things like, other people frequently tell me that what I've said is impolite, even though I think it's polite, or it's hard for me to avoid getting sidetracked in conversations. And these two were significant, whereas social skills, which might be better understood as social motivation, was not significant. So things like, I find myself drawn more strongly to people than to things. So I just wanted to briefly talk about the fact that I decided to look at traits because obviously clinical population is better, and I am currently gathering clinical data at the moment, but I just wanted to say that traits associated with autism do vary across the population, but the experiences of autistic people are distinct, are often due to the intensity and frequency of traits over a number of areas. So I'm not saying that just because we see this in traits, we will definitely see it in a clinical population, but we do tend to see comparisons. Finally, I have started just at the beginning stages of collecting data from autistic adults in terms of their actual qualitative experience of hyperfocus. And I think what they're starting to tell us is really quite important and interesting. And some of it does mirror the things that we've asked about in the questionnaire, but some of it doesn't. So things like, I think I tend to seek hyperfocus. I really like being so focused in on stuff. You know, these emotional elements, in terms of there's an element of guilt that always accompanies it. These aren't really picked up by questionnaires, and they're important to understand and to know about. And also, whilst you can ask about how frequently something occurs, information such as I can easily sit down with my sewing and find I've been there for 6 hours, it's not really captured by those questionnaires. And so maybe these questionnaires are more suitable in terms of population-wide measures, but as I say, we are looking at the clinical samples at the moment to see whether or not they're what sort of results we see in those groups. But yeah, thank you very much for your time, and thanks for your focus, and that's it. Thank you.
Thank you for that, Rachel. That was really interesting and great to see the whole kind of spectrum of what kind of fits into medical humanities. I did see on Twitter, which is a very good point, Rachel is not in our programme at the moment, but will be added to our programme, and then obviously once we're sort of sharing a recorded session, she'll be part of the updated programme for that, which is why you might not have been expecting her. So now we're on to the Q&A part for the first 4 speakers. So I'm going to share some of the comments. Rachel, you got a lot of compliments on your cat, which is very good. It was a good cat. So the first question, Rachel, Bonnie, Stuart and Laura, do you want to turn your cameras back on? That's not a question. Brilliant, thank you. So first question, we've got one for Rachel, which is there any research showing switches between like an autistic style of focus, which is where you've got a single focus, to an ADHD one, which is kind of more multi-focused?
Interesting question. So if I can, unfortunately I can't ask the person who's asking the question. So they mean that attention switching between, I'm not sure I quite understand. Can you repeat the question just so
Yeah, so is there any research showing switches from a more autistic style, can't focus on more than one thing at a time,
right,
to an ADHD one where multitasking may make it easier to focus?
Not to my knowledge. That doesn't mean that there aren't any, it just means that that's not something I've looked at in more detail. Yeah, if I've understood the question correctly, then they're not to my knowledge.
Thank you. And a question for Bonnie. Do you know anything about the relationship between kind of the activism of parents back in the 60s to 80s and kind of how they brought along kind of government support, financial support, and kind of, I guess, led to where we are now with the NAS and the creation of that? A bit broad question.
Yeah, it's a great question. Also, I just wanted to say this is the first time I've done a Zoom conference, and it's brilliant because I've got hundreds of questions that came up in the Q&A. So I just want to thank everybody for sending in those questions. And I was going through typing answers to all of them, but I haven't managed to do all of them, but I will. I'll do all of them. So with regard to the parental activism, that was incredibly important in the 1960s. It was hugely important that parents were getting involved in descriptions of autism and new psychiatric definitions of autism at this time. And of course, Lorna Wing, who is the woman who redefined the category of autism in 1979, was a parent. You know, she was somebody who was really driving those changes, and she was working with other parents at the time, Sybil Elgar and others who set up schools for autistic children. So parental activism was incredibly important in that period of time. And if it weren't for that, you know, we wouldn't have seen the changes that have taken place now.
And Stuart, as someone who's done research into kind of parenting and autism identity, do you have anything kind of to add? Any thoughts around the idea of role of parents in the 60s?
Just to say quickly, I'd echo Bonnie's points about how well this has worked out so far across Zoom, and I've answered all the questions I had individually, so I hope people have got their answers if they ask me. Not as much as Bonnie would know about parents in the 60s, given her own expertise, but Bonnie, the name I thought of immediately was Michael Barron, who, if I remember, was the first, was it president of what became the National Autistic Society? And he was a great advocate for the community. And I had quite a few long conversations with him about the sheer difficulties that were faced by parents at that time, because obviously the spectre, if that's the best word, of Bruno Bettelheim was very powerful through the 50s and into the 60s with its assumptions about parental behavior and autism causation. And I know that Michael felt that it was, you know, just incredibly hard to get some foundational ideas about what autism was, how it existed within families, raised and discussed at kind of, you know, social and political levels. So I you know, and if I think I'm right in saying that his son Christopher was one of the first people actually diagnosed with autism in the UK. And so that would have been late 50s, I think, I'm not entirely sure. And of course, Michael's son, Saskia Baron, is a filmmaker and an artist, and has gone on to say lots about the autistic movement. I mean, yes, that was, I think for those of us who brought up autistic kids, certainly in a pre-internet age, you know, my own experience was on that cusp between analog and digital. And I do think, in fact, there's probably some really interesting work that could be done on what it was, you know, on the differences between those two era, if I can put it like that. Because I think obviously the internet has made a huge difference to experiences of autism and expressions of autism. But yes, I mean, for those of us who were bringing autistic children up, say 20, 25 years ago, I remember thinking and just touching base with the idea of how difficult it must have been in the 60s.
Thank you. So a question, I guess, across quite a lot of your research is one around kind of the portrayal of kind of a savant. I mean, Laura, going to you first, obviously looking at Morose, who's very much a comic character. Do you see kind of any presentations in the 17th century of autistic people on the other side of the spectrum, the more savant side?
That's a really good question. Off the top of my head, because I mainly work on literary representations, which particularly in the theatre tend to be more a magnifying glass on traits that work in the theatre, so like hatred of noise, for example, or particular ways of speaking. Savants in literature, I can't think of any off the top of my head, but I know that as soon as we finish this seminar, I'll think of one and I'll send it to you. Sorry.
Brilliant. And I know, Stuart, you mentioned Rain Man briefly in your talk. Do you think that kind of is a starting point where this idea of an autistic savant became quite popular? Or do you think, was there anything, you know, or Bonnie yourself, that was there beforehand?
I've always been struck by the fact that, and I remember seeing Rain Man as a 21-year-old student in 1988. And I wish I could say that I remember what I felt about it at the time, but that would be making something up, I think. But I've always been struck by the idea that the film put forward an idea, a representation, a characterization of autism before it was a condition that was largely known to the public. So what interested me, I mean, I think that's very unusual. You may have been working in medicine, or you may have been a parent, or you may have been working in education, but I think outside of that, autism was not a well-known concept in the mid-1980s. I think it's very interesting that when you talk to the filmmakers who made Rain Man, and when you see what they thought they were trying to do, the Savantism was seen as something that was really productive and quite full of potential, and was definitely put in the film as a positive. And I think that, you know, there is much, particularly within the autism community, there is much vitriol might be too strong a word, but there is much directed towards Rain Man that sometimes I wonder if it does maybe not deserve. But I think undoubtedly one thing that was taken away from the film for a general public was this idea of Savantism. I mean, it's part of a wider idea, isn't it, of a compensation narrative, you know, which is a strong disability narrative, that if you lack something, if you have an absence of something in area A, it is made up for by something positive and productive in area B. And that's very common, and I think most of us here having this conversation this afternoon will know that quite well. And of course, it's just part of that wider idea of kind of fascination with neurology. I guess somebody like Oliver Sacks is really important for spreading this in lots of ways, isn't he? About, you know, supposedly abnormal ways of cognitive conceiving of the world that a mainstream audience can't have. So, in fact, yes, I think that the savant situation, or rather the representation of savantism, has a huge history that dates from the 1980s and still manifests itself. I remember colleagues at work asking me if my sons had special skills when they heard that they were autistic, and that wasn't that long ago. So I guess that's what I mean by soft power in my talk. That's what I'm trying to ideas, but in the culture at large and the way it apprehends
Thank you, Stuart.
medical conditions.
Thank you.
Can I just add very quickly?
Yeah.
There was a BBC documentary made about the artist Stephen Wiltshire in 1987, which was very significant, I think, in terms of representing artistic skills in autism. And that was, I just wanted to sort of raise people's awareness to that. It's available, I think, on YouTube. You can watch it. It's quite an interesting representation at that time.
Yeah. And Rachel, I just wanted to bring to you, because kind of when you think of savantism, I guess a part of it is it linked to hyperfocus? Is that do the two?
Yeah, I think that's one of the interesting things that I found when I read the review paper I referred to at the beginning, was that there was this assumption that hyperfocus would lead to an increased skill, and in flow, which is similarly described, again there is this assumption that this is related to improvement in skill. And I think sometimes when people experience hyperfocus, they often have a subjective experience of being able to perform better in those states. So I don't think that it's completely without basis, but I think at the moment maybe it's overstated in terms of we've actually got little research to actually state that there is a direct impact between being able to hyperfocus frequently and being able to perform well on certain in certain subjects or on certain tasks.
That's really interesting. Another question that's come through, and obviously you can answer this hypothetically or your own experience, is how kind of a role of being someone of connection to autism themselves, whether you're autistic or a parent, do you find that kind of plays a role in the direction of the data you come across? I don't know who wants to start answering that one first.
I think it definitely plays a role for me. It's quite interesting in terms of I think sometimes I've got this idea that I need to be subjective, and I've trying to move away from this and actually realise that actually looking at experience is a good first starting point, and it might just be a starting point, but it's an important starting point for me. And also I think that sometimes it can actually lead me to question things. The benefit of it can be that it can lead me to question things because maybe I kind of know from my experience somebody is seeing that as a negative trait, whereas actually it's not as simple as that in many cases.
Thank you. Laura, do you have anything to add? I wasn't sure if you were about to speak or not.
Oh no, I was just moving around. But yeah, I thought that was a really good answer. I guess I was thinking about what enables me to get access to data in the first place. And I was thinking about this phrase, sly normality, from Mills, that in order to gain a place in the academy in the first place and be studying Renaissance literature, I've had to sometimes strategically practice a kind of sly normality in order to, I'm not advocating this at all, but I've been kind of thinking about the ways in which autistic people, autistic bodies and autistic minds are kind of admitted into the academy, and ways in which that could be changed from inside or outside. Basing that, what else was I going to say? Oh yeah, also in terms of like access to data, like, because I work on literature, which is very different to the types of things that Rachel has been talking about. I would say that I often just use my instinct. So when I was reading Epicene, I just got a kind of gut feeling about this character, and I thought, it was almost like a kind of autistic gaydar. I'm not quite sure how to describe it. And this kind of that's my way of reading, I think, kind of learning to trust my gut instincts. I don't need always to go and read loads of theoretical texts about autism to get a feeling about Morose. So that's not very scientific at all, but that's how I approach my data.
Thank you. Bonnie, do you have anything kind of your experience?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's interesting for me, because I've always come at this, as I said at the beginning of the talk, as a historian, and I and maybe that's a label for me, but it's been incredibly enlightening for me to sort of see and engage with all the new researchers who are working on this, particularly people like Stephen Capp, who's just asked me a question on the online chat, so I know he's there, and Damien Milton and others who are taking, really, really different and interesting approaches to sort of material that I've looked at before, but in a really new and dynamic way. And so, that has enabled me to see things in a really different way and really challenge the conclusions that I'd come up with beforehand, just looking at the historical material. So, it's great to see the new research that's being done in this, among or by autistic researchers now. So it's it's really good.
I know, Stuart, you mentioned right at the start that it was kind of your sons that led you into the whole kind of area of research to begin with.
Yes, that's right. And I think one of the things that I took away from that was in effect there was a realization that my own work was a kind of advocacy, I suppose. That supposition maybe that scholars have a natural distance, from the material that they might be reading, particularly in the literature department, if they are reading literature from previous centuries. I found I couldn't help but, it's a bit like Rachel's point about the gut instinct, I suppose. Sorry, was it Laura's point? That I couldn't help but feel that my gut instinct was to write in that way as a kind of advocate. And I'm always drawn towards people with autism and writers on autism who do the same. Although I think that there came a point in my own work where I realized that there was a certain kind of bias that came from that, and I wanted to step back and read the works of others. So I remember reading Bonnie's book, for example, and getting a whole different historical perspective that I didn't know about and hadn't existed before. So yes, I think it's one of those situations where there's no reason why the scholarship can't be practiced without a commitment to the community, if I can put it like that, which is my experience of working within disability more generally.
Yeah, thank you, Stuart. I'll leave it there. For those of you who haven't had your questions answered, I think some of the speakers are answering them text, which is brilliant. We've got a 10-minute break now so people can get up, move around, and just wake up a little bit, because I know I find it really hard to stay sitting still for a long time. So we'll be back and starting again if everyone can be back about 4:10, and we'll get going with the second half of speakers. Thank you very much, Rachel, Laura and Stuart. That was really brilliant.
Thank you.